In the summer of 2010, an American car brand died, and almost no one noticed. There was no farewell edition, no final lap around a track, no last gray car rolled into the light for the cameras. Mercury simply stopped. A name that had filled driveways and lined main streets for 72 years was switched off the way a man turns out a porch lamp at the end of a long night. And here is the part that should bother anyone who ever loved a car. Mercury did not die because it could not build a good one. It had already built one of the most beautiful machines this country ever produced. It had strong engines, a national network of dealers, and stretches of sales any rival would have envied. It died because, by the very end, it could no longer answer the one question a brand has to answer. Who is this car for? Hold on to that question, because the answer runs deeper than any balance sheet. To understand how a name that strong went quiet, you have to go back to a decision that was far braver than most people remember. The year was 1938, and the country had not yet climbed all the way out of the Great Depression. At the Ford Motor Company, a man named Edsel Ford looked at the market and saw a hole in his own lineup. Below him sat Ford, plain and cheap and everywhere. Above him sat Lincoln, formal and expensive and rare. In between, where most American families actually lived their lives, there was nothing wearing his name. And General Motors was feasting in exactly that space, fielding a whole ladder of brands a buyer could climb one rung at a time, from Chevrolet up through Pontiac and Oldsmobile and Buick. So Edsel Ford built a new brand to fill the gap. He called it Mercury. It was not a vanity project, and it was not an accident. It was a calculated strike at the soft middle of the market, aimed at the working man who was doing a little better than he had last year and wanted a car that quietly said so. Not a rich man's car, a rising man's car. From a strategy standpoint, it made perfect sense. Ford was too plain. Lincoln was too grand. Mercury would be the next step up for the man on his way. The original idea was sound, and for a while it was exactly right. Behind that idea were the people who would actually build it, the men on the lines in the plants around Detroit, who would stamp the steel and hang the doors and torque the bolts, shift after shift, year after year. For them, a new brand was not a line on a chart. It was work. It was paychecks and overtime, and a reason the lights stayed on in the neighborhood and the church on the corner kept its doors open. That is the part the strategy memos never recorded, and the part this story keeps returning to. The first car arrived in November of 1938. They called it the Mercury 8. In its first year, the new brand sold around 65,000 cars, and that number was no fluke. The Mercury 8 rode on a wheelbase about 4 inches longer than a Ford's. Its body was low and long, with smooth, unbroken metal where a Ford had fussier, more fragmented lines. The roof flowed, the tail sat heavy and planted, so the car looked settled, even standing still, like something built for an open highway rather than a crowded city block. Under the hood was a flathead V8, making about 100 horsepower. Not the most powerful engine in the land, but smooth and quiet and unmistakably American. You could hear it idling at a stoplight, a low, even murmur, and smell the fresh paint and new upholstery when you swung the heavy door open. Step inside, and the difference was just as clear. Thick seats, deep cushions, and more chrome on the dashboard than any Ford buyer ever saw. Mercury, in those first years, knew exactly what it was. It was not a Lincoln, and it never pretended to be. It was a car for a man with a family, a steady job, and the wish for something a little finer, without the need to show off. Then the world went to war, and the assembly lines fell silent. In 1942, only about 24,700 Mercurys came off the line before the factories were turned over to the war effort. When peace returned, America did not simply go back to building cars, it exploded into it. New highways reached out across the country, the middle class swelled, and people wanted automobiles that were bigger, stronger, and brighter than anything from before. Mercury came into that moment with a rare advantage. It was ready. In 1945, Ford folded Mercury together with Lincoln into a single division. On paper, it was housekeeping. In practice, it nudged Mercury upward, a step closer to luxury and a step further from Ford's plain image. And then came the car that this whole story is named for. The 1949 Mercury was not a facelift. It was a rebirth in steel. The body was now one integrated whole, wide and low and substantial, with the wheels pulled deep into the bodywork and a shoulder line that ran clean and unbroken from the nose all the way to the tail. In profile, the car looked like it was already moving while it stood at the curb. The front end was restrained, a thick dark grille that refused the flashy chrome of a Cadillac. This was not a car that flaunted money. It projected something quieter and harder to buy, a kind of calm confidence. Inside, the same philosophy held: spacious, thickly padded seats, and a dashboard that was simple but solid, perfectly in tune with the mood of a country settling into its post-war prosperity. There was no revolutionary engine under the hood. What mattered was the way it felt on the road, solid and smooth and relaxed at speed. The effect was immediate. From a pleasant, mid-priced brand, Mercury became a style icon almost overnight. Sales jumped six-fold over the year before, and the shape itself took on a life that would outlast the company that made it. Those low, clean proportions made the 1949 Mercury a favorite of customizers and hot rodders for decades to come. A few years later, a young actor named James Dean would lean against a chopped and lowered 1949 Mercury in a film called Rebel Without a Cause, and that single image would outlive the man, the studio, and eventually the brand itself. When people picture the soul of Mercury, this is the car they see. In 1953, the brand reached the highest share of the American market it would ever hold, around 5%, a peak it would never touch again. Names like Monterey began to define what Mercury meant: more upscale than a Ford, younger than a Lincoln. For a man who had come up through the Depression and home from a war, a Mercury in the driveway was a small, polished proof that he had made it, that the lean years were finally behind him, and the neighbors could see it. And the brand grew restless and inventive in a way that was charming and, sometimes, foolish. There was the Monterey Sun Valley, with a roof panel of clear-tinted acrylic set over the front seats, an idea that was both daring and a little naive. It looked wonderful in the brochure. Under a July sun, it turned the cabin into a greenhouse. A few years later came the Turnpike Cruiser, a halo car loaded with gadgets, including a rear window that powered down into the body so air could flow through the cabin. It was clever, and complicated, and not entirely practical. That was Mercury in those years, always reaching for something, and not always sure why. It could build muscle. It could build muscle. Too. In 1958 came an engine called the Super Marauder, a 430 cubic inch V8 rated at 400 horsepower. It was the first mass-produced engine sold in America advertised at that number, years before the muscle car era even had a name. Here was proof that Mercury could build not just smooth cars, but genuinely fast ones. The ambition was real. It simply arrived a little early to be understood, and the brand barely bothered to tell anyone it existed. Only about 100 of those engines were ever built. And here, near the height of its powers, the first real crack appeared, and it had nothing to do with the cars themselves. It was in the organization chart. Mercury was shuffled together with Edsel and Lincoln, then split apart, then merged again. Management churned, and with every reshuffle, the brand's sense of itself blurred a little more. It was still selling well, but it was beginning to lose the thread of what it was for. The 1960s forced a reckoning that was probably unavoidable. Costs had to come down. A sharp young executive named Robert McNamara streamlined the company, and from that point on, Mercury began sharing its bones with Ford more than ever before. The same platforms, the same underpinnings, dressed in different sheet metal. On a spreadsheet, it added up. For the brand's soul, it was a blade that cut both ways. The first new car of that era was the Comet, a compact that reached the market in 1960, a full year ahead of the equivalent from General Motors. The Comet was clean, straightforward, almost conservative, small and boxy, with simple lines and chrome kept to a minimum. It did not try to dazzle anyone on the boulevard. It wanted to blend into everyday life. The interior followed the same logic, clear and easy to read, with materials a touch better than a Ford's, but not enough to make anyone say, "This is a Mercury." The seats were comfortable and unpretentious. Everything about it was correct. Nothing about it stayed with you. And in truth, the Comet was probably the car the market needed right then. It just was not a car anyone fell in love with. Then came 1967, and Mercury surged back on its own terms. First was the Cougar, a premium pony car slotted neatly between the Ford Mustang and the Thunderbird. Though it shared a platform with the Mustang, it was reworked into something longer, wider, and calmer. Its signature was a set of hidden headlamps that gave the nose a clean, unbroken face when they were closed, and a full-width tail lamp broken into sections that looked more modern and more expensive than anything on a Mustang. Inside, especially in its richest trim, the Cougar was finished better than almost any pony car of its day, with a full set of gauges, wood trim, soft materials, and seats shaped for long miles behind the wheel. It leaned toward grand touring rather than raw sport. Its V8 tuned for smooth, easy power. For once, Mercury had built something that was clearly its own, not a Ford in a nicer suit. The Cougar became one of the cars that defined the whole premium pony car idea of the late 1960s. That same year, the Marquis arrived, a full-size sedan built to stand just above the Ford it was based on. From across a parking lot, it announced its philosophy: long, wide, low, and substantial, with broad flat panels and a straight shoulder line that gave it a sense of weight and stability on the highway. The grille was large and heavy, the chrome restrained. The marquee did not try to impress through boldness. It impressed through presence. Inside were wide bench seats with thick padding, a dashboard that stretched out horizontally with plenty of wood and chrome, and a cabin kept quiet against the road. Exactly what you wanted from a car built to cross a continent in comfort. For a moment, Mercury seemed to know itself again. Then the ground shifted under the entire industry. The oil crisis, tightening emissions rules, and a wave of capable cars from Europe pushed Mercury into a decade best described as trying everything while understanding itself less and less. With pressure mounting and no time to design from scratch, it chose the fastest path it could find. It reached for imports. The Capri was brought over from Ford's operations in Germany, a small, light, rear-drive coupe with a real European feel, nimble and frugal and well-matched to the moment. But for years it did not even wear the Mercury name. It was simply sold through Lincoln Mercury showrooms. Even Mercury, it seemed, was not sure how fully to claim it. Then, at the opposite extreme, came the De Tomaso Pantera, a mid-engine exotic with a seductive Italian body, a true sports car chassis, and an American V8 mounted behind the driver. On paper, it was a dream. European theater with Detroit muscle, sitting in a Mercury showroom. In the metal, it felt like a creature from another planet. Low, hot, loud, demanding constant care. Completely foreign to everything Mercury had ever stood for. And there was the trouble laid bare. At one end of the lot, a thrifty little European coupe. At the other, a snarling supercar. And in the middle, no single thread left that anyone could call Mercury. And yet the cars kept selling. In 1978, Mercury set a record, moving around 580,000 vehicles, with close to 40% of them Cougars. Into the early 1980s, the brand reached its final sales peak, holding near 670,000 cars a year. On paper, triumph. Look a little closer, and the old paradox is staring right back. Mercury was selling more cars than ever before, and saying less than ever about who it actually was. Even the Cougar, the brand's brightest star, drifted with the years. The lean premium pony car of 1967 slowly swelled into a soft, formal personal luxury coupe chasing the Thunderbird, until the name that had once meant a sharp, hidden-eyed grand tour could be pinned on almost anything in the catalog. It was the whole story of Mercury in miniature. A clear idea, allowed to soften year by year, until it meant, whatever that season happened to need it to mean. In 1986, it tried to answer with the Sable, the face of the new aerodynamic age. It was the opposite of the sharp, boxy styling that had come before, all rounded and seamless, with low drag surfaces and one unmistakable signature, a band of light running the full width of the nose. Inside it was clean and modern and, once again, a clear step above the Ford it shared so much with. For a season or two, Mercury looked like a brand with a future. But the imports kept arriving, and each one chipped away from a different angle. The Tracer was built on a Mazda platform, tidy and frugal and reliable, and it drove exactly like the Japanese car it was, only wearing a Mercury badge. The Villager was a minivan engineered with Nissan, spacious and dependable, and Japanese to its core in everything but the emblem on the hood. There was the Mercury Experiment, a pair of advanced European cars, a turbocharged coupe and an upscale sedan called the Scorpio, sold through Lincoln Mercury dealers to buyers who, it turned out, did not exist in anything like the numbers required. Mercury's people wanted V8s and easy ownership, not delicate European machines that asked for patience, careful maintenance, and parts that were hard to find. The Mercury was a good car set down in the wrong place, and after a few weak years, it was gone. By 1997, Mercury climbed aboard the rising tide of sport utilities with the Mountaineer. In honest terms, it was a Ford Explorer with a different grille, a little more leather, and a little more chrome. It sold. And it confirmed the thing no one in the building wanted to say out loud. Badge engineering was no longer a tactic to get through a hard year. It had quietly become the entire strategy. It is worth stopping here to remember who was not in the room when these choices were made. The men and women on the assembly lines did not vote to sell a rebadged Explorer, or to import a brand's identity from another continent. They built whatever the offices above them sent down, and they built it well. Their hands were as skilled as ever. It was the thinking around their work that had thinned out, decided far from the factory floor by people reading sales charts and cost columns. There is an old argument that never ends in any garage where men of a certain age gather. Some will tell you the American car was killed by corporate greed, by executives chasing the next quarter. Others will tell you it was the unions, that wages and rules climbed until the company could no longer compete. Both sides are pointing at something real. What is harder to argue is that the worker who actually knew how to build the thing was almost never the one in the room when the fate of his work was decided. And when a plant finally went dark, it took far more than jobs with it. It took the thing that had given a town its rhythm and its pride, the reason the diner stayed open past the late shift and the high school stands filled up on a Friday night. By the 2000s, Mercury was trapped in a quiet contradiction. It spent its marketing money trying to grow younger, while it survived on the loyalty of customers who had grown old alongside it. The campaigns chased a fresh, Youthful buyer. The sales charts told a different story. The bestseller remained the Grand Marquis, a big, traditional, body-on-frame sedan, soft and smooth and familiar, bought by people who had been driving Mercuries for 40 years. The rest of the lineup was a patchwork of good intentions. The Mariner arrived just as the sport utility boom met a new sense of conscience, and its hybrid version made the brand look responsible and modern. But underneath it was a familiar small Ford, with nothing in its design or its driving feel to remind a buyer that this was a Mercury and not simply one more option on a crowded lot. The Milan was meant to be the modern mid-size sedan, clean and pleasant and reasonable, and it played that part well. It played it so well, so reasonably, that it said nothing at all. It carried none of the old Mercury smoothness, and it took none of the risks that might have made it stick in the memory. Even the revived Sable, launched with real hope, chose the safest road available and 1960 and became a face that no one quite remembered. That was the heart of the whole problem. When the Ford Motor Company was forced to rebuild itself after the financial crisis at the end of that decade, Mercury became a question that answered itself. If these cars already existed as Fords, sharing the same platforms, the same engines, the same technology, separated by little more than a badge and a strip of trim, then why did the brand need to exist at all? On the 2nd of June, 2010, Ford gave its answer.
Another American car brand is no more. Today, Ford announced it's dropping the Mercury brand at the end of the year. Marissa Cleaver is live at Ford Claycomo plant where the Mercury Mariner is made.
Well, Elizabeth, a sigh of relief here for the thousands of workers here at the Ford Claycomo plant. No jobs will be lost.
The brand's share of the new car market had fallen to around 1%. In its final full year, it had sold fewer than 93,000 cars across the entire country. By the end, Mercury was moving fewer vehicles than Oldsmobile or Plymouth had been selling just before those names disappeared too. There was no commemorative model, no final bow under the lights. The last Mercury, a Grand Marquis, rolled off the line at St. Thomas, in Ontario, early in the new year, and the brand walked off the stage without a word. Look back across the whole journey, and you do not find a company that failed for lack of engineering. Mercury had everything an American carmaker needs. Strong engines, designs that once led the entire industry, a wide dealer network, years of sales that other brands would have killed for. What it lacked, more and more as the decades passed, was an identity that someone was willing to protect all the way to the end. The real failure was not platform sharing itself. Every modern carmaker shares parts. The mistake was using it as the whole plan instead of as a foundation to build a character on top of. Too many decisions were half-made. Just enough money to keep the lights on, never enough to truly stand apart. High hopes and low commitment, again and again, and the brand never held one ideal long enough for it to harden into a legacy. It was the steady American middle, then it was youthful, then it was European, then it was Japanese. Each turn made sense on its own. Together they left Mercury as a collection of cars that shared a badge and nothing else. Buick had dared to be Buick. Oldsmobile, for a long time, had dared to be Oldsmobile. Mercury, in the end, never quite dared to be anything all the way through. The industry knew how to end a name with some dignity when it had to. A brand could be retired cleanly, its best cars folded back into the parent, its story closed with a single clear sentence. Mercury was given none of that. It was never truly redefined, and it was never released in time. It was simply allowed to thin out, year after year, model after borrowed model, until there was almost nothing left to say goodbye to. Think one more time about those plants, and the people inside them. The men who hung the doors on a 1949 Mercury, the car that made the whole brand a symbol, were long retired or long gone by the time the name finally came down. They had given their working lives to something they believed would outlast them. The badge they helped make beautiful faded out like a single closed line on a ledger. No headline. No mourning. Just a quiet absence where a piece of the country used to be. And maybe that is the hardest part to sit with. Mercury once stood for a real idea, that an ordinary family deserved a car with a little more grace than the cheapest thing on the lot. The 1949 model had proved it could be done. When the company stopped believing in that idea, the name on the trunk stopped meaning anything, and a name that means nothing has no reason to go on. If a Mercury ever sat in your family's driveway, a chrome-heavy Monterey, a Cougar you saved up for, a Grand Marquis that carried you through 100,000 quiet miles, or even just a faded 1949 coupe and an old photograph on the wall, tell us about it in the comments below. This channel exists for the brands and the factories that built this country and then slipped away from it, and the people who keep those memories alive are the ones down in that comment section. If this story made you stop and remember a car, or a plant, or a man who spent his whole life inside one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so the next forgotten name can find its way back to you. We will see you in the next one.